Dr. Jada Reynolds sank into her first-class seat, a deep breath escaping her lips as she settled in for the flight from New York to Miami. For once, the usually weighty world of New York Presbyterian Hospital seemed far away. The cabin lights bathed her face in a warm glow, emphasizing her sharp features and the deep brown of her skin. At 36, Jada had become one of the youngest and most respected trauma surgeons in the country. She deserved a break, at least, that's what her colleagues had insisted, though even now, she struggled to let go of the tension that knotted her shoulders. It hadn't been an easy road. Growing up in Harlem, Jada had been raised by parents who embodied hard work, a mother who taught in public schools, and a father who worked long shifts as a nurse. They had given her love and an unyielding belief in her potential. Still, Jada learned early on that being exceptional wasn't just encouraged, it was mandatory. She had to be twice as good, twice as focused, and endure twice the skepticism, just to get the opportunities her peers seemed to stumble into. The scholarship to Stanford, the acceptance to Harvard Medical School, each victory came with a price of sleepless nights and an unrelenting determination that wore her down but never broke her. Jada looked out the window, watching as the runway lights blurred into golden streaks. Today, she'd left behind her packed surgery schedule, her pager, the never-ending calls. And yet, guilt sat heavy in her chest. Her fingers reached down to touch the stethoscope nestled inside her bag. She never traveled without it, a small symbol of her calling, a promise she had made to herself and her community. As the last of the passengers boarded, Jada felt the stares. It wasn't unfamiliar, the sideways glances, the subtle questioning of how someone like her, a young black woman, could belong in first class. Jada had grown accustomed to the double take, the small pause before strangers managed to mask their surprise. She kept her expression serene, her lips curving into a gentle smile for those who made eye contact. The seat next to her remained empty until she saw a man approaching, middle-aged, white, wearing a suit that seemed more expensive than well-fitting. He was struggling with an oversized carry-on, his face flushed as he wrestled with the bag and muttered under his breath. Jada watched, then spoke up softly, "Need a hand with that?" He barely glanced at her, his voice laced with annoyance. "No, I've got it," he snapped, his tone making it clear he didn't welcome the offer. She watched as the bag teetered, nearly falling before a flight attendant stepped in. "Sir, I'm afraid that's too large for the overhead." "We'll need to check it," the flight attendant said, her tone professional. The man huffed, clearly irritated. "Ridiculous," he muttered, "I've used this bag for years in first class. Never had a problem before." "I understand, sir, but for safety," the flight attendant began, and with a begrudging sigh, he handed over the bag. He dropped into the seat beside Jada, muttering, "First class isn't what it used to be." Jada gave him a polite smile. "It can be frustrating," she said, "but I think they're just trying to keep us safe." He turned to look at her, really seeing her for the first time. His eyes narrowed, a skeptical glint in them. "And what would you know about safety? You some kind of expert?" Jada felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the quiet flare of irritation. She met his gaze, her voice steady. "Actually, I'm a trauma surgeon. Dr. Jada Reynolds." The man blinked, clearly taken aback. He paused before offering his hand, his demeanor shifting slightly. "Travis Whitmore," he said, CEO of Whitmore Construction. His handshake was brief, more out of obligation than genuine interest. "A surgeon, huh?" he continued, his tone still carrying an edge of disbelief. What kind of surgeries? Trauma, Jada answered. Emergencies, accidents, gunshot wounds. Travis's brow furrowed, a hint of skepticism still there. Impressive, he said, for someone your age. Jada resisted the urge to roll her eyes. I've been practicing for almost a decade, she replied, keeping her tone even. I completed my residency at New York Presbyterian. Travis nodded, his gaze lingering on her. Must be nice, he said. First-class ticket, vacation in Miami. When I was starting out, I could barely afford a day off. I've saved for this, Jada said, her voice calm but firm. Self-care is important in a high-stress job. Self-care, Travis muttered, almost scoffing. That's what they're calling it now, huh? Before Jada could reply, a commotion at the front of the cabin caught her attention. A man in one of the front rows was clutching his chest, his face pale and twisted in pain. He gasped for air, his hands trembling. Without hesitation, Jada unbuckled her seatbelt, standing up quickly. Excuse me, she said to Travis, her voice sharp with urgency as she moved past him. She called out to the flight attendants, I'm a doctor. Let me help. Jada reached the man's side, her trained eyes taking in his symptoms, sweaty skin, labored breathing, the way his hand pressed against his chest. Sir, can you hear me? She asked, her voice calm. I need the first aid kit, and if you have aspirin or nitroglycerin, bring it now. The flight attendants scrambled to comply, and a nurse from a nearby seat came forward to assist. Jada worked quickly, her focus narrowing to the man in front of her. She gave him aspirin to chew, speaking to him in a low, soothing voice as she and the nurse worked together to stabilize his condition. The cabin, which had been buzzing with anxious murmurs, grew quiet as passengers watched in awe. Jada's hands moved with precision, her face a mask of calm confidence as she worked to ease the man's pain. Slowly, his breathing steadied, color returning to his cheeks. When the crisis had passed, the cabin erupted in applause. Jada took a deep breath, her own pulse slowly returning to normal. She walked back to her seat, her eyes meeting Travis's as she sat down. His expression was a mix of embarrassment and something that looked like regret. Dr. Reynolds, he began, his voice lower now, almost hesitant. I didn't realize. I didn't think. Jada looked at him, her face impassive. Maybe next time, she said quietly, you'll think twice before making assumptions. Travis looked away, his face flushed. He was silent for the rest of the flight, his earlier arrogance replaced by a thoughtful, almost troubled expression. When they landed in Miami, Travis cleared his throat, his voice hesitant as they stood to disembark. Dr. Reynolds, he said, I owe you an apology. I was wrong to judge you, and I'm sorry. Jada paused, considering his words. It's not just about an apology, Mr. Whitmore, she said, her tone gentle but firm. It's about understanding why you made those assumptions in the first place. He nodded, his eyes dropping. You're right, he said softly. I have a lot to think about. Jada gave him a small nod. I hope you do. As she stepped off the plane and into the warm, humid Miami air, Jada felt lighter. She had faced yet another moment of doubt, another challenge to her worth, and she had risen above it. Maybe she'd planted a seed of change in Travis, maybe in others who had watched. And maybe that was enough.